Did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise? It's not a story the Jedi would tell you, which is why it is very fortunate that you stumbled upon us today, my friend. For almost 1,000 years, the Sith have been in hiding, watching, growing, and waiting as the galaxy descends into rot and decay. But this was not an accident. For the Sith themselves were the ones who facilitated that change. It was their fangs that administers the necrotic venom that has corroded society itself, as well as the very resolve of the Jedi Order. And while Darth Sidious was the fulfiller of these things, he would not have brought it to bear without the work and deeds of Darth Plagueis the Wise, a man who took the Sith from being a part of the galaxy's elite to controlling it. And he took simply being aware of the midi-chlorians to commanding them. He was a Dark Lord who took a closer look at the Force than any Sith before him, a man who picked it apart at its most basic of elements and then learned to bend them all to his will. And at the same time, he did the same with the Republic. The holocrons today open, and they shed their light once again. And in this documentary event, we will officially bring you the life and legacy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Chapter 1, Destined for the Darkness. Our story begins with a Bith man by the name of Rugus Gnome, but those enlightened will know him better as Darth Tenebrous. As the current Darth Lord of the Sith in the Rule of Two lineage, Tenebrous was looking for an apprentice of his very own. However, his goals were not simply to train them and continue the Bainite lineage. Tenebrous had since hatched a sinister plot to find a suitable host, one that he could possess the consciousness of and live beyond death. After studying many Jedi prophecies, observing recent events, and running calculations with his super-enhanced alien mind, Tenebrous had determined that the Chosen One was going to be born within the next few generations. He had developed a virus known as the midi-chlorians, those that could house his consciousness within them and allow him to infect a host body. Very soon, this virus would allow him to take control of their Force abilities, and even their mind. The ultimate end goal of this nefarious plan, though, was to eventually locate the Chosen One while they were still a child. Tenebrous would then possess them while they were too young to interfere or resist, thereby gaining access to their colossal power. Tenebrous would then rule forever with the power of the Chosen One. But there were still many years to come before he calculated the Chosen One would be born. In the meantime, he needed an exceptionally powerful being to serve as his host, and by chance, he would eventually meet a moon by the name of Car Damask, who was a mid-level agent for the Intergalactic Banking Clan and the administrator of Midi-chlorians. Tenebrous detected that Car Damask was indeed Force sensitive, but that he did not possess the amount of midi-chlorians that Tenebrous was hoping for. A little time would pass, however, and Tenebrous would soon encounter another moon, a female who had the same issue. A high midi-chlorian count, but not high enough for the expensive taste of Tenebrous. However, the Sith calculated that if he were to bring the two moons together, their offspring would be something far beyond the two of them combined, and could create something truly special. Revealing his true nature to the female, he conscripted the woman to be a disciple for a time, but not actually making her an official apprentice. While it has not been confirmed, it is suggested that the woman was aware of her place in Tenebrous's grand plan, and the plan of the Sith, and so following the instruction of the Dark Lord, and become his codicil wife, which was the moon's societal term for a non-primary partner. The exact date of Darth Plagueis' birth is unfortunately unknown, as Plagueis himself makes several contradictory statements about his birth and his time as a youth. But at some point between the years 167 and 130 BBY, or before the Battle of Yavin, the codicil wife of Car would give birth, naming the boy Higo after his grandfather. His father, Car, however, cared very little about his illegitimate son, not realizing the potential that he had just sired. But Higo's mother was keenly aware of his destiny, and as a result, she kept an extremely close eye on him, being so attentive that Higo's entire childhood was smothered and ordered at every single step. She recorded every detail of his upbringing, even the most surreptitious of his thoughts. There was nothing that Higo's mother did not know about. Growing up in the domed city of Midi-chlorians, Higo rarely left his mother's overly attentive sight. She would provide playmates for him, if only to observe his interactions with other children. And afterwards, she would interrogate him about his feelings regarding each specific youngling. All of this was because she was eagerly anticipating the day that he would begin to show signs of Force sensitivity. Only then could she fulfill the quest given to her by her master. At long last, he began to show the powers that had been carefully cultivated within him, and around 5 years old, Higo discovered that he could manipulate the Force itself, using it to probe the feelings of his playmates. He eventually tested the limits of his power by using a very potent mind trick on a moon youngling that he had grown to dislike. Higo convinced the boy to jump from a high window, resulting in the child's death. Higo's mother instructed her son to keep his powers secret, however, and confided in him that they shared that same gift. But now that the boy had manifested his powers in the Force and showed a penchant for the dark side, Higo's mother contacted Tenebrous. When the Bith arrived, he ended up negotiating with Car Damask, promising him a substantial career advancement in exchange for his son. Car likely did not know that Rugus Nome's true identity was that of Darth Tenebrous, as the Bith simply stated that he wanted to raise his own protege. Car, being a greedy and an ambitious man, accepted the offer and traded his son away for power. Tenebrous then pulled some strings with the shadowy network of contacts, and soon, Car Damask was appointed as director of the treasury branch of the Intergalactic Banking Clan, and not too long after this, he rose to be the chairman of the IBC. Higo's mother, on the other hand, would mysteriously vanish and was never heard from again. Her fate is unknown, but we at the archives believe that she had been disposed of by Tenebrous, who was cleaning up all loose ends. Meanwhile, the very young Higo Damask was handed off to Tenebrous to begin his training, and for the very first time he would leave Midi-chlorians and would be dubbed Darth Plagueis. And so it would be that Plagueis never knew a truly normal life at all. Having basically been grown in captivity till the age of 5, his entire life would pivot into the way of the Sith. And with no say in his own path, his destiny had been chosen for him, and it was one of darkness, obsession, evil, and power. We Sith are an unseen opposition, a phantom menace. Where the Sith once wore armor, we now wear cloaks, but the Force works through us all the more powerfully in our invisibility. For the present, the more covert that we remain, the more influence that we have. Our revenge will be achieved not through subjugation, but by contagion. These were the words of Tenebrous to a very young Plagueis during the earliest years of his apprenticeship. It was the foundation of life within the Rule of Two. Tenebrous's alter ego, Rugus Nome, was a publicly very successful starship designer, and as a result, he was always in the highest of society, interacting with important figures, building a large network of contacts for the Sith's plan. For 900 years, the Order had been carefully weaving a web of corruption throughout the stars, and now, the Sith had made their way into that same aristocracy. The web was about to get even larger. Rugus Nome helped jumpstart the Sith into the elite of society, and Plagueis would learn at his feet. Plagueis would travel around the galaxy with his master, masquerading as his young accountant, and in the process he learned both the ways of the dark side and the shrewd business practice of his Bith master. Something very clear became known. In this new era, it was just as important for the Sith to develop diplomacy and finance skills as it was for them to have lightsaber combat techniques. They were all weapons. And by now, the Sith had grown, evolved. The new Sith Empire was not one of militaries and monsters, but of capitalism and commercial interest. In his years of tutelage, Plagueis would become very accustomed to the Outer Rim territories of space. Typically, moons were known for exclusively living in comfortable places, such as their home planet of Moonalist. This was considered a paradise of worlds, but Plagueis did not know a comfortable life at all during his apprenticeship. He got used to making his home on backwater planets, seedy cantinas, lowly places in the dark. He developed a special interest for remote worlds, later saying that they held a sort of allure to him. This worked greatly in the advantage of the Rule of Two, as despite hiding in plain sight and being a part of high society, both Tenebrous and Plagueis still sometimes physically hid in dark crevices around the stars. One could never be too careful. Tenebrous Paramount taught Plagueis about subterfuge, using the dark side to further his advancements. One of his very first missions with Tenebrous involved him visiting the planet of Cursed around the year 104 BBY. This was a secret world that was deleted from the Republic archives by the Rule of Two long ago, and it was here where they ritualistically brought their apprentices to test their combat skills. Unfortunately, not much is known about the planet or its natives, only that they were an incredibly violent species, one that had grown very cultish and worshipped the Sith as gods. It was customary for the Rule of Two to force their apprentices to fight these natives en masse. And in the process, Tenebrous discovered that Plagueis had an aptitude for lightsaber combat. The young Moon was talented in the art of repeatedly proving himself with the blade, as he was an exceptional warrior even among the Banite lineage. Tenebrous often made his apprentice spar with him for enjoyment, finding the challenge to be exhilarating. Though ironically, Plagueis found lightsaber combat to be a tedious affair. He stated that it was filled with needless acrobatics and showmanship. He didn't believe himself to be above such fighting, but mostly preferred to defeat his enemies using the Force. For him, the lightsaber was a tool of torture or death, not an instrument for dueling. However, he begrudgingly appeased his master's thirst for combat, and ended up getting very well trained because of it. In 99 BBY, Plagueis would finally go on his first mission alone, and his task was a simple one: assassination. He was to attend a banquet on the world of Kuralag, and dispose of an individual by the name of Karad Santh, a man who had become a business rival to the Sith, and an obstacle for Tenebrous. During the banquet, Plagueis would take advantage of the fact that blow eel was being served. This was a particularly venomous creature that had to be prepared very specially by chefs in a very specific way, lest the highly toxic venom seep into the meat. When the eating began, Plagueis sneakily began to choke Santh with the Force. His assassination was a complete success, as the businessman strangled to death in front of everyone there, and Plagueis managed to cover it up by blaming it on the chefs for negligent preparation. It was around this time that Higo would decide that he wanted to return to his family and establish an enterprise of his own away from his master. And according to a story that would later be told to us by Plagueis' mouth directly, he returned to his people's home planet of Moonalis to finally encounter the rest of his clan. However, as the son of Car Damask's codicil wife, Plagueis was treated as an interloper, disliked by his half-brothers and sisters. They scorned him and attempted to have him disinherited from their father's will. Soon, Car Damask became gravely ill due to a genetic defect in his third heart. Plagueis would later claim that before his death, Car told Higo to do whatever it took to ensure his own survival and the prosperity within the family, to ensure that they remain rich. His half-siblings and their mother, Car's first wife, had the condition passed on to them as well. However, Higo did not have this issue, since he had been born from a different woman. Plagueis watched his siblings and their mother spend millions of credits on geneticists in order to cure this condition, but behind closed doors, the geneticist was an actor, one paid off by Plagueis to conduct phony treatments, not helping them at all. Plagueis would watch with great pleasure as each of his siblings went to an early grave one by one, and each time they died, he thought it was fun to pretend to mourn at their funerals, later enjoying feigning indifference when each of their capital assets were directly given to him. And in the end, Plagueis inherited their father's wealth, which they had all attempted to deny him. As an aside, this part of the story is actually a bit foggy. What we mean is, this was an anecdote that Plagueis would later tell Palpatine as a method of manipulation, which we will eventually get to, of course, in our story. However, Palpatine would later suspect the story of Plagueis killing his family was embellished, and when he confronted him about lying, Plagueis admitted to only some of it being true. So all in all, we actually don't know which parts of his story and history are true and what were lies. Since Plagueis himself never elaborated on the matter though, we can only present his words as they are spoken. But nevertheless, the end goal was the same. His father and his family perished, leaving Higo Damask as the sole heir to his father's fortune and his title. This position and title was incredibly important to the Sith's plan, as the intergalactic banking clan dated back to the founding of the very Republic itself. It funded governments, supported settlements, and bankrolled countless commerce guilds, trade corporations, and shipping cartels. The IBC dictated the ebb and flow of wealth from the core to the outer rim. It was even said that scarcely was a building raised on Coruscant without the banking clan's approval first. Scarcely the starship left the yards of Kuat or Fondor without the IBC having brokering that deal. And scarcely an election occurred on Corellia or Comenor without the moons having been consulted first. This was just a taste of just how staggeringly powerful the IBC had become, and now through Darth Plagueis, they belonged to the Sith. With the sudden attainment of great financial power, Higo Damask would also take over his father's control of the important moon by the name of Sojourn. Long ago, when the moon was first discovered, its ancient fort was founded by the members of the intergalactic banking clan. They had created this as a place for relaxation for the clan's wealthiest clientele, and with it being a location of great historical significance, it was also a place where many of the galaxy's wealthiest elite would gather for secret meetings. Plagueis would make this world his personal retreat, and establish a company known as Damask Holdings there. This would be the clandestine financial group allied with the banking clan, and it acted both as a lobbying and a political organization which involved itself in the galaxy's affairs, both to exploit local resources, finances, or influence on a galactic scale. After having committed all of this murder and subterfuge, Higo finally saw the truth. The Sith way was simply his way of life. He did not know any other life than the one that had been given to him, Having been deprived of a normal life was actually a fortune to him, the way that he had never known to be weak, mundane existence at all of the lesser beings that now surrounded him. He was meant to rule, and no one, not even Tenebrous, could stop him. Damask Holdings would become a tool for the Sith agenda, and Plagueis went even further, doing so with his Sojourn Retreat. This is when he constructed grand palaces, luxury resorts, all riddled with Sith symbology, images of the dark side, carvings on every surface. And to complete his plans, Damask Holdings started hosting an event known as The Gathering. The Gathering began when many influential beings were brought to sojourn in ships owned by Higo Damask. None without invitation would arrive. It was sort of an occult gathering wherein the elite would take part in ceremonial hunting and ritualistic debauchery. Unbeknownst to them, they were surrounded by long-forgotten Sith symbols that only Plagueis himself could read. These annual meetings consisted of politicians, the leaders of various trade organizations and cartels, and even powerful gangsters. The gathering even became a rite of passage for those wanting to enter into the folds of the galaxy's elite. Plagueis' goal was to bring the most influential beings to his influence, with the ultimate outcome having the entire galaxy at his will, the elite submitting themselves to the Sith through ritual. By this time, Plagueis had returned to the side of Tenebrous though, but their relationship had now evolved. They had reached an impasse in their ideologies regarding the Sith imperative. Tenebrous believed that victory could be achieved through the mating power of the dark side, as well as implementing expert Bith science. His plan was, with the aid of sophisticated computers and future casting formulas, the various beings of the galaxy could be provided for, and the Jedi Order would gradually swindle and disappear. Plagueis believed that eventually he could compete with the Jedi Order for the soul of the galaxy, taking their place as the providers of the masses, and the public opinion would favor the Sith so much more that the Jedi would be seen as ineffectual, as a relic of the past. Tenebrous had tried to persuade Plagueis that the Force did not play games of chance with the galaxy, and that while the fated ascendancy of the dark side could be predicted, its rise could not be influenced or hurried by the Sith. Plagueis, however, was not a fatalist. He argued that future events, whether predicted by machines or glimpses and visions, were often clouded and unreliable. More importantly, Plagueis had been raised to believe in the total elimination of all competitors. Tenebrous believed that they could simply compete with the Jedi and then phase them out gradually by taking their place. But Plagueis knew that the Jedi Order was not simply a rival corporation that could be secretly acquired. To Plagueis, the Jedi were an enemy that needed to be undermined, toppled, dismantled, and eliminated. It was presumed that around this time, Tenebrous had actually begun to secretly train another apprentice, Darth Venomous. This was a Bith like Tenebrous, and it was clear that the Dark Lord had seen Plagueis as unfit to be his successor, mainly due to the fact that they disagreed on the outcome of the end of the Rule of Two. And although Venomous was aware of Plagueis' existence, Plagueis was kept in the dark and continued to believe that he was his master's sole apprentice. But this is extremely important to the life of Plagueis, because from this moment, Tenebrous neglected Plagueis' training. He did not invest in teaching him the things of the dark side as he once had, and instead gave Darth Plagueis busy work. He would send him on missions that Plagueis ultimately deemed to be pointless distractions. But the one part that Darth Tenebrous did pay attention to, however, was Plagueis' growing interest in the midi-chlorians, his unprecedented ability to interact, to influence them. Full control was beyond his grasp, but the ability to reach into the microscopic parts of the Force was unparalleled by anyone before Plagueis. However, he made sure that the moon would only apply it to the preservation of the extension of his own life, thus ensuring that he would live long enough for Tenebrous to possess the body of the Chosen One. While Plagueis was not aware of his master's plan to possess him, he was getting wise to the fact that Tenebrous seemed to be under the impression that his life was going to be extremely long, and that he had now only begun to live it. With the Sith training being neglected though, Plagueis decided to take matters into his own hands. For the next several decades, he would largely develop his skills in the Force alone. The galaxy would be his teacher. He did this in private, never revealing the extent of his true power to Tenebrous, which was now rapidly growing. In fact, it would not be long before Plagueis eventually surpassed his master in power, and a plan began to emerge within the moon's mind. Chapter 2: Darth Plagueis Ascends. In 67 BBY, the two Sith Lords would make their way to the planet of Baldemnik. Tenebrous had previously discovered a vein of the extremely rare cortosis on the world, and decided to survey it with his own eyes. Accompanying them was the tread droid and a M2 mining probe. Their ship would touch down inside a cave grotto on the side of the steep slope of the shore of Baldemnic Sea. Wearing enviro suits to protect them from the deadly heat of the mine, the Sith set out to study the Cortosis vein. As the M2 mining probe drilled deeper into the cave, Tenebrous became sentimental and began to pontificate how the Rule of Two had finally come full circle. Darth Bane had started as a Cortosis miner long ago on the world of Epatros, and here they were, nearly a millennium later, mining Cortosis as the grand plan began to reach fruition. Trouble began, however, when the tread droid informed them that the N2 mining probe had reached a pocket of lethane gas, a highly combustible substance that would explode if touched by the heat of the probe's hydraulic jacks. Tenebrous ordered the droid to shut down immediately, but for some reason the mining probe had overridden the tread droid commands to deactivate. It had been sabotaged with the intent of killing Tenebrous and Plagueis by subtext mining. The intent is unclear, but the two Sith Lords made many enemies in their business world, and a lot of the men were not above assassination, or lacked the means to do so. The two Sith Lords then attempted to deactivate the droid themselves, pouring force lightning down the mine shaft, but their powers were hindered by the crystals and Cortosis ore that surrounded them. The droid was imminently drilling into the lethane pocket, giving the two no other choice but to flee. Summoning force speed to bolt out of the cavern, and during that escape Plagueis sensed a curious amount of fear and anxiety within his master, though he could not locate its source. The two of them managed to escape the cavern and make their way into the grotto where their ship was docked, but it was too late. The droid's hydraulic jack struck the lethane pocket and unleashed an explosion of sizable proportions. Tenebrous used the force to contain the massive fireball that was threatening to consume them, as tremors from the explosion also sent large chunks of rock raining down into the cavern that crushed their ship. Tenebrous held aloft the slabs of stone that would have destroyed their only way out, but while the Bith was busy, Plagueis suddenly understood what had been causing so much fear in his master. He sensed his own death was close at hand, and taking advantage of the moment, Plagueis reached up to the rocks, those that were falling on top of his master, and brought them down with the force, increasing the swiftness of their fall so that it was too fast for the Bith to react. And with that, Plagueis finally crushed his master. Once all the tremors ceased, Plagueis rushed to his dying master's side, pretending to be concerned for his well-being. Tenebrous gave him a speech, telling him with his last words that he was to bring to fruition the grand plan. But right in the middle of this touching speech, his advanced mind ran some calculations, and the Bith realized that Plagueis had been the one to undo him here. The moon took great pleasure in owning up to it, and with a swift motion, he snapped his master's neck. Plagueis had achieved his goal. He had achieved the goal of the Dark Lord. Tenebrous took a few more minutes to die, however, and Plagueis observed his midi-chlorians as they did. He honed his skill enough to observe the midi-chlorians, but not quite influence them just yet. And so he was intrigued by how they acted in a force-sensitive being who was dying. And while he watched this process, he also pondered about how in Bane's day, an apprentice may have to worry about their master's spirit leaping into them via essence transfer. But luckily for Plagueis, the knowledge of that ability had been lost because of the Sith Lord Darth Gravid. However, little did Plagueis know, Tenebrous had circumvented this. As Plagueis stood there, the midi-chlorians began carrying Tenebrous's intelligence as it slipped out of his body undetected and infected a wound in the moon's lower back, one caused by a stray falling rock. As the midi-chlorian virus propagated inside of Plagueis' cells, Tenebrous hijacked his apprentice's powers of foresight. Tenebrous began to have visions, and was actively growing excited, as Tenebrous had given up on these powers in order to code his intelligence into the retrovirus, now eager to use the ability again. But as he peered into the future, what he witnessed terrified him. Instead of providing access to the Chosen One, Plagueis instead died at the hands of his own apprentice. Tenebrous slipped out of Plagueis' body in a panic, but it left him in a spiritual loop of reliving his moment of death, over and over again for eternity, one of the worst fates in all of Star Wars lore. But at long last, after being apprenticed to Tenebrous for nearly as long as a standard human lifespan, Plagueis had become the master. He felt the force swell within him, and his power was inexplicitly amplified. Having now brought upon him the true mantle of the Dark Lord, the dark side rewarded him with unexplainable strength. And now that he was the master, he had other ideas on how he wanted to conduct things. First and foremost, he was exhausted, irritated with the Rule of Two. Plagueis wanted to rule as an immortal god, and getting rid of his doddering old master was just the first step in freeing himself from the shackles of the Bainite tradition. However, having an apprentice was still paramount to any Sith Lord that wanted things to get done correctly. Right now though, he had other fish to fry. He was now the last Sith in existence, and he was wounded, stranded on a backwater world. Before his death, Tenebrous was furious with his apprentice for allowing their ship to be crushed. He believed that Plagueis had doomed the Sith entirely, but Plagueis himself was not concerned. Once he took his master's lightsaber and his own travel bag filled with his personal items, Plagueis climbed his way back to the surface. He then took off once again with force speed. Channeling the dark side within himself, swift as the wind, Plagueis crossed on foot the main continent of Baldemnik in the span of a standard day. And the only reason it took this long was because he swerved around the territory of the Konome, Baldemnik's native and hostile reptilian species. The Sith didn't want to have the trouble of leaving more bodies in his wake, and so he found it easier to do things stealthily. He slept in a tomb-like cave carved by the Konome, and when he awoke, he was so hungry that he had the impulse to raid one of their homes, to feed on both their eggs and the blood of the parents. But he dissuaded his appetite for terror and bloodshed, as instead, he fed himself with hawkbats and raw fish along the shoreline. Along his journey, he would end up having a vision concerning Baldemnik. He saw it embroiled in a multi-fronted war, in part because of its rich deposits of cortosis, but more as a pawn of a convoluted game. Unbeknownst to him, Plagueis had just glimpsed the Clone Wars. Eventually, Plagueis found his way to the small spaceport of the world, and after searching around he found a large enough vessel, a cargo freighter to suit his needs. A ship by the name of the Woebegone. The ship was carrying fresh sea life to the world of Ithor, which wasn't too far from the world of Munalist, and after acquiring information about the ship and its captain, Plagueis snuck aboard the Woebegone within one of the refrigerated crates and hid within the cargo hold. He would make great use of his species' ability to regulate blood flow of their hearts in order to survive in freezing temperatures. But soon, the crew would discover that they had a stowaway. Confronting Plagueis, it confounded them why a moon, a being of unrivaled social and economical status, would be avoiding commercial space lines, stowing away aboard this cargo ship. And then there was the matter that he was bleeding from his wound in his back. Plagueis refused to divulge any information about himself, and insisted that he would pay the captain to take him to Munalist. He even offered to pay a coverage fee for the merchandise that he had ruined by bleeding on the fish. But the negotiations went south as the crew instead wanted to contact Baldemnik's authorities to make sure that he was not a fugitive. Plagueis had attempted to rely on diplomacy, but he could not allow them to contact the planet. There needed to be no evidence that he had ever been there. The crew of the Woebegone would have been much better off just by taking that money. Instead, they were brutally slaughtered with his lightsaber. One was paralyzed with a kick, and another had his bones disintegrated with force lightning. But while all of this was inconvenient, it was not a total loss for Plagueis. These victims would become his brand new subjects. He quickly knelt down and reached into the microscopic space of the midi-chlorians. But this time, instead of simply observing them dying off, Plagueis actively attempted to influence them. Unfortunately, he failed in managing to prolong any of their lives. But for Plagueis, mending organs and broken bones was no more difficult than levitating objects was. But to goad the midi-chlorians into actually helping him to make it permanent was out of his reach for this moment. He was not able to stop them from rapidly deteriorating, and the Dark Lord was so frustrated both at his failure and the sloppiness on his part due to his plan and his fatigue, he scorned himself, saying that had his lightsaber movements been cleaner, he may have been able to prolong their lives enough to study them better. The only remaining being on the ship was a multi-armed medical droid known as 11-4D. Plagueis himself had something of a soft spot for droids, finding them to be quite reliable. They followed orders, executed commands with precision, and were often clandestine in nature, not to mention easier to work with. They didn't have to be paid off just to keep their mouths shut. One simply needed to issue the order. Right before the explosion in the Baldemnik mines, the tread droid had to stay behind to continue attempting to stop the M2 mining probe droid, and it was stated that if an explosion were to occur, that droid would be destroyed. Plagueis expressed to the tread droid that it had been useful, and Tenebrous had sneered at him for this comment, telling him that he wasted his breath on such beings as droids. But it just went to show that Plagueis had a deep appreciation for artificial life, even if it was something that he kept to himself. At his sanctuary home on Moonalist, Plagueis kept a rather extensive collection of these droids, and 11-4D would end up becoming a great companion of his from this point on, even until the end of his life. This all began with Plagueis asking the droid to repair the festering wound on his back, and to fetch him some food and drink. After all that had happened, Plagueis was famished. On his way to Moonalist, Plagueis would make a pit stop at the space station that the woe began sealed and slagged. This is to say, totally liquefied the ship without any remaining evidence of what had occurred. The demolitionist planet was owned by the boss Cabra of the Black Sun, with whom Plagueis had very good relations. He would then acquire a brand new ship that would take him the rest of the way to Moonalist. When finally arriving on the world and landing on his home planet, Plagueis shows how the Sith weave themselves into the galactic society, seamlessly resuming his life as Magister Higo Damask. A single day ago he had murdered his master, ran across a barren continent, survived only a small creatures that he ate alive, and brutally eviscerated an entire crew of a ship that he stowed away on. But upon reaching Moonalist, he was well-groomed, well-respected, an entrepreneur that the galactic elite knew that they wanted to know, and he effortlessly began taking care of business affairs. The first order of business was a meeting with his own financial protege, and the most trusted agent of all, a man by the name of Larsh Hill. He would explain in private that Rugus Gnome was now dead, and to make arrangements to acquire his assets once his death was made public. Plagueis, of course, was interested in the legal acquisition of the antiques kept by his master. All of that is to say, his collection of Sith artifacts that Tenebrous undoubtedly owned and had pined over. The other matter was Baldemnik. Plagueis arranged for Damask Holdings to acquire as much land in the northeast quadrant as possible. This was the mine that he and Tenebrous had just examined. The Cortosis would be an important tool for them to use later. The Jedi Order had an agreement with the Senate that they would receive first dibs on all Cortosis deposits that were found across the stars. Cortosis was dangerous to Jedi, as it had the unique property of deactivating lightsabers, and the Jedi attempted to keep a tight control on the distribution of the metal. Because of this, Plagueis made sure to acquire the land as soon as possible, using intermediaries so that it could not be traced back to him. And on top of Baldemnik, he told Larsh Hill to extend an invitation to the owners of the Subtext Mining Corporation. Much of this in preparation for the gathering on the world of Sojourn. As the gathering commenced, Plagueis wanted to use the opportunity to investigate why the M2 mining probe had been sabotaged. Though Plagueis took advantage of the opportunity the droid created to murder his master, he had not been the one to rig the probe to hit the gas pocket, which meant that someone wanted both him and Rugus Gnome dead, and that they had nearly succeeded. Their would-be assassin was a threat, and Plagueis knew that the best way to find them would be finding who supplied the droid, the Subtext Mining Corporation. Plagueis briefly visited his Sanctuary of Solitude, located in a volcanic mountain. There, he introduced 11-4D to what his new home would be, and while his house did have a vast collection of fine art, those were things that were mostly gifts to him from others. Other rooms were filled with data collection, holovid receivers to keep in touch with the ongoings of the wider galaxy, keeping Plagueis constantly connected. And then, of course, there were galleries overflowing with extensive libraries of ancient documents, tomes. Plagueis had recorded media on anything ranging from tree trunks, parchment, all the way to storage crystals and holocrons. Traditionally, moons were said to loathe any kind of literature that wasn't a legal document or loan notices. And yet, Plagueis had one of the most extensive libraries outside of the Jedi archives themselves. In the temperature-controlled rooms, Plagueis stored a collection of commentaries and expositions accumulated over centuries by Sith, and even their unwitting agents. He possessed ancient histories of the Rakata, the sorcerers of Tund, and writing of Queen Aminoa of Onderon, who was the greatest disciple of the Sith Frieden Nad. But Plagueis also had writings from light-side organizations, those from the followers of Palwa, and even writings from the Dai Bendu. And of course, he had many writings about the long-lived species of the galaxy, as he obsessively studied what made their ages stretch to near immortality. Deeper within this mountain fortress was his lab, where his real work was conducted. Within cages, bacta tanks, stasis fields, and bioreactors, Plagueis kept a living collection, a grotesque amalgamation of creatures from remote worlds from across the stars. Some were bestial, others were semi-sentient, and yet others were just as sentient as humanoids. Some were kept at death's door, others had freshly hatched, and there were even some Frankenstein monsters that Plagueis had stitched together himself from parts of other beings. 11-4D, being a medical droid specialist, scanned everything in Plagueis' lab and admitted that there were many creatures and flora that he was unfamiliar with. Plagueis was pleased to hear this, having acquired a droid with medical knowledge, as it could help him with his deep research. He instructed the droid to familiarize himself with everything in the lab, all of the data that Plagueis had accumulated, including the entire history of the Sith Order. And it was here where he revealed his purpose for all of this to the droid: to extend his life indefinitely, to become immortal. Plagueis was not interested in learning the power of essence transfer, not because the knowledge was lost, but because he did not wish to be disembodied, a spirit haunting a tomb or a talisman, goading and convincing weak-willed beings to serve his bidding. He did not wish to have his mind take over the body of an apprentice or background clone. Nothing short of immortality of his own brain and body would suffice. True, everlasting life. Unfortunately, so much crucial knowledge had been lost during the madness of the Sith Darth Gravid, and many of the most important elements of Sith training had since been passed from master to apprentice in succession, had been left unrecorded. Not to mention, Plagueis was also uninterested in following in the footsteps of men like Vitiate and Nihilus. In his words, the ancient Sith had managed to come halfway across the bridge between life and death. But they had been so focused on worldly power that they ended up trapping themselves between realms. And the fact that they had never provided the Sith Order from guidance from the great beyond meant to Plagueis that their influence had been negligible and had long since faded away. Plagueis said that the Dark Lords of the past doomed themselves to the Nether Realm through their attempts to conquer death by feeding off of the energies of others. Plagueis desired to tap into the deeper strata of the Force, to learn to speak the language of the midi-chlorians themselves. But aside from all of this, Plagueis could now officially say that he was the master, and it was up to him to see the grand plan reach fruition. Now finally alone in his laboratory, he could for the first time feel the dark side not as a mere supporting wind, but as a hurricane, becoming a storm of destruction on the crumbling Republic and the Jedi. A scouring storm that would lay waste to everything antiquated and corrupt, paving the way for a new order. An order in which the Sith would be returned as the stewards of the galaxy. Before them, all the species of the galaxy would bow in fear and gratitude for having been drawn back from the brink of death and stagnation. And in this moment, Plagueis could feel himself standing in the eye of that storm, and there he heard the voices of all of the Sith of the past, those who had laid the groundwork for the grand plan. His power was now truly magnified, and Plagueis felt the imperative of his mission. It was all at once daunting and invigorating. The winds of change were blowing, and Plagueis was now the one directing them. Not too long following this, it was at last time for the gathering to take place. Grand hunts took place as the galaxy's elite rifled through the forest, gunning down clone creatures such as Nexu, Acklays, and Reeks. They all came back with their hunts with ceremonious chanting, all a ritual with great Sith influence. But again, none of them knew it. Into the night, wine flowed freely, as did provocative entertainment and roasting of bloodied meat over bonfires. It was a night of revelry, debauchery, and good business. Higo himself did not take place in the rituals, but performed duties as the host of them. And it is here where he met Gardulla the Hutt. Gardulla, who was coming with a request of a financial support, while she made a bid to take over the world of Tatooine. Damask agreed to her, so long as she gave him a sizable portion of the cut from the Boonta Eve pod race that she had planned to bring back. And along with that, she was asked to instate one of Damask's criminal contacts, as Plagueis wanted to gain access to the world of Nal Hutta. Once their business concluded, there were other beings that required his attention, such as the secretary and representative of the Yinchori Council of Elders. The Yinchori were a territorial reptilian species that were particularly resistant to Force suggestion. They had come to Damask with a request for his support in lobbying for the Yinchori to have representation in the Senate. They were underprivileged, and from a backwater world despite having been settled by the Republic centuries earlier. Higo was less interested in their plight, or any of their problems. Plagueis had another goal. He wanted to see how truly gifted they were in stopping Force persuasion. He attempted twice to influence the mind of the secretary, and to the Sith's astonishment, it had absolutely no effect. Once again, his mind was riddled with questions on how the midi-chlorians of a low intelligence being could resist the influence of a powerful Dark Lord of the Sith. He desperately wanted to study them, and made a mental note to acquire one of their species for that sole purpose. To conclude the meeting, he acquiesced to their request for a lobbying in the Senate, though he warned that it could take years or even decades to see it through. He also had the condition that they would owe him a favor, something that he put in the back pocket of the Sith's plans for the future. The next person requiring Plagueis' attention was a senator by the name of Pax Team from Malastare. The senator had a problem over supporting Gardulla's reinstatement of the pod race on Tatooine, which would put her in direct competition with the pod race on Malastare. He was also angered about Damas supporting the Trade Federation's ability to gain representation within the Senate. Higo, however, dismissed all of his concerns and suggested that he raise the price of Malastare's fuel distribution, doing so to offset the loss in revenue from the pod races. Enraged at the suggestion, Pax Team said that even doing so would benefit the banking clan in return, and that even his enemy, the Trade Federation, would become richer as a result. The senator then stormed off, swearing that Higo would regret crossing him. And at the time, Plagueis did not take this interaction seriously at all. However, Pax Team and the Grand Protectorate of Malastare would eventually prove to be a very problematic enemy, but one that quickly exited Plagueis' mind for the time. At long last, the people that Plagueis truly wanted to meet with graced his presence, the Gossam owners of Subtext Mining, the ones that had supplied the sabotaged M2 mining probe droid on Baldemnik. Plagueis acted cordially with them, as he invited them to see the inner workings of the gathering. He took them to a facility beneath the courtyard where all the bonfires and revelry was taking place, and in that area, there were large hydraulic lift platforms with chained up beasts that would be raised up to the courtyard, only to be blasted to a smoking husk by the automated turrets above. It was all a sick, twisted show. It was a bloodthirsty, crowd-pleasing stunt. And Higo then revealed the true threatening purpose that he had brought them down there, when he had his Ichani Sun Guards force the Gossams onto one of the platforms at blaster point. The group was mortified, as Plagueis ordered for the platform to be raised. If it reached the top of the courtyard, they would all be blasted to pieces by the turrets. As the platform raised, Plagueis told them that the probe that they had supplied to murdered Rugus Gnome had succeeded. Begging for their lives, the Gossams told him that they could make it all right. They then decided to sell the information they had on the unfathomably large plasma reservoir on the world of Naboo. They claimed it was an untapped resource that would power 1,000 worlds. They also revealed that there was a faction on Naboo in opposition to the current king, and they wished to see the world open to the galactic trade. But the king wanted to keep Naboo isolated. Satisfied with this payment of information, Plagueis allowed all of them to live, and had the platform lowered yet again. It seemed to him that he would need to pay a visit to Naboo for a potentially huge payout, and if he were able to support the faction that was in opposition to this king, Plagueis could instate a new king who would open the planet and its resources up to galactic trade. Some years ago, Damas had secretly negotiated for the Trade Federation to accept the expansion of free trade zones in the Outer Rim. This came at the cost of some of its shipping monopoly, and exposing it to competition from startup companies. In exchange, though, the Trade Federation received full voting privileges in the Senate, though much of the leadership was still disgruntled at the loss of some of the monopoly. Plagueis, however, surmised that a huge payout from this plasma export could be enough to pacify the Trade Federation's leadership, therefore cementing them under the thumb of the Sith forever. The entire point of the gathering was to meet and negotiate with various business owners and financiers, convincing them all to do things with the Republic, to do things with their business that on the surface seemed motivated only by self-interest. Behind all of these closed doors, Plagueis convinced them all that he was organizing an oligarchy to take over the Republic, putting all of them in charge. Everyone there believed that they were taking part in something secretive, grand, and something that would echo across the Republic for centuries. But they were none the wiser. They were all pawns, in actuality, conducting plans that belonged to a force much greater than any of them. All of this was necessary to off-balance the Republic from within, however, to prime it for the eventual toppling when the Sith revealed themselves. This just goes to show how much the Order had truly changed from the days of massive fleets and armies of red lightsabers. The Rule of Two now fought with the almighty dollar, harnessing the greed of the galaxy's elite with just as much finesse as they wielded the dark side with, and they had become much, much more dangerous. After the gathering ceased and the elites returned to their wealthy homes, Plagueis strode about in the dark early morning. But that is when he was given a notification by the Sun Guards that the perimeter alarm had now been tripped. Plagueis reached out with his feelings and felt that it was undoubtedly a Force wielder. one with great skill. Plagueis' thoughts raced. What if a Jedi had infiltrated his sanctuary? Plagueis dashed out into the forest, lightsaber held ready in hand, determined to deal with the situation himself. But what the Dark Lord found was what he least had expected to see. A Bith like Tenebrous. A Bith with a lightsaber. The Bith called himself Darth Venomous, the true apprentice of Darth Tenebrous, who had come to kill Plagueis on his master's final order. Plagueis was shocked and disgusted to see another Sith like himself. But this one, he believed, was a pretender. His title of Darth was illegitimate. He had not earned it. And Plagueis took great pleasure in informing him that Tenebrous was now dead, killed by his hand. Venomous vowed to avenge his fallen master and become the Dark Lord that Plagueis would never be, and the moon invited his challenge as the two crossed blades at last. The duel was fierce and ferocious. Venomous had been trained very well, and what's more is he had been trained in Plagueis' exact lightsaber style. It appeared that Tenebrous had trained this one to specifically counter Plagueis himself. Another insult from the grave. With speed unknowable to any but a Force-sensitive's eye, the two battled like flashes of lightning among a dark forest. But as good as Venomous was, they could only stalemate at the lightsaber. The Bith found that he could not overcome his enemy, but neither could Plagueis gain an advantage either. But Plagueis had more than the lightsaber. But the true Sith had left lightsabers as a thing of the past, a toy. They were tools more for ceremony, and Plagueis himself despised lightsaber combat. He found it boring. And so he would prove his superiority in another way, as the Dark Lord of the Sith began to show his power in the Force. The power that had been amplified with the death of Darth Tenebrous. The dark side had sung his name, not the name of this false pretender Venomous. He gathered his energy within him as a lightning rod, and struck out with such power that it blasted Venomous' lightsaber from his grasp. Plagueis called it to his own hand, and crossed the sabers across the Bith's throat, forcing him to yield. Venomous now submitted, declaring that he would serve as Plagueis' apprentice. The Dark Lord sneered at the idea, stating that if he were to take him as an apprentice, that he would be constantly having to watch his back. Plagueis then reaffirmed that the future of the Sith no longer hinges on physical prowess, but on political cunning. The new Sith will rule less by brute force, but by a means of instilling fear. As for what would become of Venomous though, Plagueis had a fate worse than death planned. He took a nearby poisonous plant and forced Venomous to eat it, promising that it would stop him from dying. And from that moment forward, the Bith would become Plagueis' greatest experiment, a plaything. A quick investigation of Venomous' ship revealed that the Bith had already set his eyes on a few potential beings who could become his apprentice, and among them was the Shido shapeshifter, an Iktachi prophet, and a Natolan. Plagueis decided to set out to investigate all of these beings for himself, to see if they would be worthy for apprenticeship, or if they were potential rivals. The first he found gambling at a casino, and 11D shot him in the base of the head with a sleeper dart. After questioning him, it was revealed that he was trying to pay off the businessman Karad Santh, and second, pay off his debts to the Black Sun Syndicate. Since he was completely unaware of the Sith, Plagueis let him go free, but warned him to take some of the winnings and make a new life. On the world of Selukami, Plagueis found the Iktachi prophet. The prophet was preaching to a crowd of people about the fall of the Jedi and the Republic that she had foreseen. Plagueis would electrocute her with Force lightning to end her babbling so that she did not tip off the Jedi about the Sith's grand plan. Next, they would find the Natolan, who they found out was a Sith pretender, claiming to be a Dark Lord having studied under Darth Venomous. Plagueis insisted that they prove that fact, and manipulated them into getting into a duel with the Jedi Master and a Padawan. Plagueis amusingly watched from the shadows as the Jedi easily dismantled this Sith imposter. And with this final matter of business concluded, it was time for Darth Plagueis to make his journey to none other than the planet of Naboo. And although he was headed for its plasma reserves, the Dark Lord was unprepared for the true riches that he would uncover, in the form of a son of a connected Naboo noble. A being that would change the course of galactic history forever. Chapter 3: The Fated Apprentice. In a hollow meeting between Damask Holdings and Ars Varuna of Naboo, the issues were now laid bare. Currently, an election was being held on Naboo for who would ascend to the crown. The conservative royals, which was supported by the majority of the noble houses on the planet, were backing the current king's re-election to maintain an isolationist policy However, the Liberal Party, headed by Bon Tapalo, the man whom Varuna worked for, were the ones that wished to open galactic trade to the ones like Damask Holdings, and that is exactly who Plagueis had reached out to. During this holo meeting, Higo Damask expressed that, in exchange for financial and logistical support in the upcoming election, Damask Holdings was asking for the exclusive rights to transport plasma from their reservoir. However, it was leaked that the Tapalo party had been in talks with Damask Holdings, and so their royal political enemies began a propaganda campaign that accused Tapalo of selling Naboo to the highest bidder, then buddying up to the Extra Systems cartels. Around this time, Naboo had a long-standing history of forbidding outside influence, so this was potentially a huge scandal, one that would cost the Tapalo party public opinion. However, yet another spy had come in favor of the Tapalo party. Some counter-allegations had come out about the men in the royal party. Around 60 years ago, when the war between the Naboo and the Gungans was occurring, many of the nobles currently aligned with the crown had contacted off-world mercenaries to help. They had managed to keep this a secret, but an unknown ally leaked this information and caused a scandal that completely overtook all of the allegations made against Tapalo. Interestingly enough, Varuna admitted that this leak had come as a surprise to all of them in the Tapalo party. They hadn't organized any spy to do this, but they were able to trace the release of the information to the young son of a noble house. The house name was Palpatine. Only a person with access to the secure family archives could have released that kind of information. House Palpatine was one of the nobles backing the royals for re-election though, which meant that the son was rebelling against the father and secretly supporting Tapalo's campaign instead. And so it seemed as though they had a potential ally, someone who could keep them informed of the royals' plans for the election. And so Plagueis decided to take it upon himself to visit Naboo, and to make a personal effort to speak to this young Palpatine face to face. Upon arriving to Naboo, Damask Holdings met with Bon Tapalo, Varuna, and the entire company to discuss their plans of the future. Afterward, Higo went to Theed University, where he located the young Sheev Palpatine, who of course only chose to go by the surname as a sort of rebellion against his family. The boy told Higo to just call him Palpatine. When Plagueis approached the lad, he was defensive, hostile, not wanting anything to do with Damask Holdings or Higo Damask. In truth, he didn't want to be seen with him publicly since his father and the university mentor were all supporters of the royalists. However, Plagueis cornered the boy, asking him to give him a short tour of Theed University, and then perhaps the wider city. This was where the two finally engaged in conversation. As Higo probed the boy with questions, he also probed him with the Force. According to Plagueis, humans were the most difficult beings to read in the Force, even in the simplest of cases. Palpatine, however, was exceptionally difficult to read. Not only was his mind awash with conflict, self-interest, and emotion, but Plagueis could scarcely sense anything about him at all. Little did he know that Palpatine was naturally gifted in an ability to conceal himself, and he used it expertly on instinct alone. And so Plagueis, a master, who could normally sense any being's midi-chlorian count, was unable to determine anything concrete about this young boy. At last though, he managed to get Palpatine to warm up to him, and the boy agreed to be a spy for Damask Holdings and the Tapalo campaign. The next day, Plagueis spent more and more time with Palpatine, as the boy took Damask on a ride in his speeder. There, Plagueis would finally get to know a little more about what was going on in Palpatine's life. He and his father were perpetually at odds for as long as he could remember. Palpatine often acted out against his father Kasinga, who would simply pay to have the problems he caused covered up so that he would not bring any shame to the larger family. This went as far as Kasinga actually bailing his son out of vehicular manslaughter when Palpatine carelessly wrecked a speeder bike into two pedestrians. But as always, his father's credits had bailed him out, and Palpatine learned absolutely nothing except that money and power made you exempt from any rule. Plagueis goes on to find out that Palpatine respects power, but that he also does not respect the Jedi. He believes that they are tied to the Senate, and they allow the Senate to dictate them where and when they can help, rather than using the Force to take charge themselves. He believed that the Senate needed to be led by someone much stronger. He also expressed that he finds his father to be a weak, inept fool who cannot elevate House Palpatine to a stronger standing. He can see what's best for Naboo. He can see that it would be best for Naboo to join with the rest of the galaxy, hence Palpatine's rebellion. All the while, Plagueis takes notes of the boy's words and his attitude. He noticed how Palpatine uses flattery, charm, and self-effacement to seem unassuming and empathetic. Here was a boy who apparently had no interest in politics, and yet was born for it. The Sith Lord was eager to use the boy's talents for his own gain, and he quickly was slipping into the role of a trusted mentor. But of course, Plagueis was desperately needing to know if Palpatine could use the Force or not. But what's fascinating about this relationship is Plagueis isn't looking for an apprentice in the traditional Bane way. He mentioned earlier that he has no need for an underling, but rather is seeking a partner, someone he could conspire with, someone who with together they could bring about real change in the Republic. As Ego Damask, he could only do so much. He needed someone just as powerful that could stretch into the Senate itself. Could perhaps this young Palpatine be the answer to all of his heart's desires? Plagueis believed he just might be. A month would pass as Plagueis moved on to see other business. He would once again meet with Pax's team on Malastare to discuss their business issues, but that meeting went sour extremely quickly, as the Grand Protectorate swore to do whatever they could to stifle the plans of Damask Holdings. However, Plagueis was not really interested in things happening away from Naboo. Palpatine had sent him several hologram messages, giving him as much information as possible about the Royalist election plan. It had been enough for T'Polo's campaign to remain ahead in all of the voting margins, and Palpatine continued to confide in Damask as a sort of mentor and a friend. The Dark Lord saw so much use for the young boy even after their businesses on Naboo concluded, and so, the Dark Lord did nothing to dissuade the attachment. But soon, the moon would return to Naboo, and there, Plagueis would be met by armed guards and escorted to the stately manor of House Palpatine, far into the Naboo countryside. There he would meet Kasinga Palpatine, who had arranged this meeting. The two sat down for a tense meal, wherein Kasinga explained why he didn't want Naboo to join the Republic at all. And when Damask responded with apathy, Kasinga threatened him that if he did not pull out of the deal with T'Polo, that he would find himself a victim of an untold event. Afterwards, he told Plagueis that he wasn't sure why he had such an interest in his son, but that he needed to stay away from him. He also revealed that he had plans to put Sheev out of Plagueis' reach anyhow, as he had already organized the boy to be transferred to a private school off-world. Following this problematic meeting, House Palpatine imposed travel bans that kept the moons off of Naboo. Kasinga also limited Palpatine's hologram transmissions in order to keep him speaking to Higo. Without young Palpatine's intel, the Royalists began gaining ground in the election. Plagueis decided to visit Palpatine in person when he went on a youth retreat to Chandrila. The Sith Lord explains in great detail what occurred between himself and Kasinga, as well as Kasinga's plans to put Palpatine out of Plagueis' reach. Palpatine, now fully enraged, began to storm around at the thought, and Plagueis noticed how the material world reacted to Palpatine's anger. Insects began buzzing erratically, flowers closed in on themselves, and even his droid 11D was beginning to shake and quiver. Palpatine begged Plagueis for advice, and to tell him what to do about his father, but Plagueis simply answered by asking the boy what he wanted. And finally, he extracted that Palpatine wanted to be a force of real change, that the boy wanted to rule. Plagueis was ecstatic. Who better than a human to wear the mask of power in the shadows while an immortal Sith Lord rules in secret? Plagueis began to tell Palpatine that if he wished to emancipate himself and see his dreams come to a reality, he had to be willing to do whatever it takes and accept the consequences of solitude that would result from it. It is here where Plagueis tells Palpatine the half-truth story about his own childhood and how he had supposedly organized the deaths of his family members so that he could ascend to power. Whether or not the story is true though, the intention was to convince Palpatine to do the same. A few days later, Plagueis was in his mountain sanctuary lab, performing test surgeries on none other than Darth Venomous. He was finally making progress. However, he felt a profound disturbance in the Force, stronger than anything he has sensed since the death of his master Tenebrous. It was at that moment that he received a deep space transmission from none other than the young Palpatine. And when he opened the comlink, the young boy was there looking panicked and distracted. He told Plagueis what had just taken place. His father had arrived unexpectedly to whisk him away to some distant planet where he could be kept and monitored. The two of them fell into an argument, and Palpatine murdered his father. But not just him, his entire family as well as even the guard that was aboard his ship. Plagueis was immensely pleased by this. His manipulations had worked, and now it was a matter of reeling Palpatine in even further. He made arrangements for the ship and the evidence to be disposed of. He then dispatched his own sun guards to retrieve Palpatine. After a week, Plagueis met with his soon-to-be apprentice aboard his own personal ship. As soon as the two of them met, Palpatine laid into the moon, calling him out for having manipulated and used his power and intel. Plagueis did not deny any of this, and even admitted that he did indeed use Palpatine. The boy then asked if any of Plagueis' story about his family was true, and Plagueis responded, some of it. He expressed that it hardly mattered now anyway though. Palpatine was free and wealthy, just as he had always desired to be, and now his true nature could finally be revealed. Palpatine expressed how the killings happened now in detail, how he had hurled the bodies with his mind, crushed the bulkheads with a thought, how he had become a storm of death. Plagueis was genuinely astonished here. The true revelations of Palpatine's power in the Force. This was the moment that he had always waited for, and now he could see Palpatine within the Force itself, revealed. His power was no longer hidden from the eye of the Dark Lord. Plagueis was ecstatic. The dark glory he beheld before him in the body of the young Palpatine would make for an extraordinary ally once his power was tamed by an experienced hand. Taking the gamble, Plagueis reveals himself as a Sith Lord and explained why they were there. Palpatine wasn't initially convinced that this wasn't some arcane cult, but Plagueis then actually showed him his true power. He stopped concealing himself in the Force personally and showed Palpatine a fraction of what he wielded. Dumbfounded by what Palpatine now sensed, he knelt before Plagueis and pledged his destiny to the Order of the Sith. Plagueis placed a hand on the young Palpatine's head and dubbed him now and forevermore Darth Sidious. Plagueis devoted almost all of his spare time to training his new apprentice. Their first outing as master and apprentice began in the snowy dunes of Mygeeto, Plagueis' own birth world. In the harsh, frigid tundra, he forced a shivering Palpatine to relive the murder of his family over and over again until he gained an authority over the memory. He started training Sidious as Sidious' own tormentor, tearing away his envirosuit so that he would have to face the unyielding cold with his bare skin, forcing him to climb up a sheer cliff while taunting him at the top, and depriving him of food or sleep for weeks. And after that, he tortured Sidious by lashing him with his lightsaber, making him crawl his way across the snowy landscape. All of this was to break him from his life, a mindset of comfort, to associate him with pain, and to teach him that nothing will come without struggle, guile, and suffering. Once he accepted this and allowed his hatred to fester within and breed power, only then would he make himself attractive to the dark side. All the while, though, he lectured him about the nature of the Sith, the dark side, teaching him of the Rule of Two. But it's here where Plagueis shows his hand, his desire to break from Bane's philosophy. In Plagueis' own words, he says this: "If you don't already want to murder me, you will before I am through with you. The urge to kill one's superior is intrinsic to the nature of its enterprise. My unassailable strength gives rise to your envy. My wisdom fuels your desire. My achievements incite your craving. Thus has it been for 1,000 years, and so it must endure until I've guided you to parity. Then, Sidious, we must do our best to sabotage the dynamic Darth Bane set in motion, because we will need each other if we're to realize our ultimate goals. In the end, there can be no secrets between us, no jealousy, no mistrust. From us the future of the Sith Fountain, and the diverse beings of the galaxy will be better for it." His intention was for the two of them to eventually rule as co-Dark Lords, immortal beings with everlasting rule and dominion over the universe itself. Plagueis appraised Sidious for having the instincts of a serial killer, but instructed him to hold that in reserve unless violence served a purpose. He states that they are not butchers like some Path Sith have been, but architects of a grand future. Sidious implored him as to how long it would take for him to learn, and Plagueis answered that it would take no sooner than a decade. Chapter 4: Growing the Grand Plan. 11 years would pass until the day of 54 BBY. In this time, Plagueis honed Sidious' skills as a Sith through many rigorous trials. During Sidious' training, Plagueis gave his apprentice access to many holocrons. Plagueis' lessons involved forcing Sidious to face his fears, denying him pleasures, and taking from him the things that he loved. He taught Sidious that emotions such as hatred and envy, though necessary to master the dark side, were simply means to an end of casting aside usual notions of morality for a greater goal. Plagueis also lectured his apprentice on the means of taking power, with the eventual goal of taking over the galaxy. He told Sidious that this time was close at hand now, and for 1,000 years the Sith have allowed themselves to be reduced to stuff of folklore. It serves their purpose. They've done nothing to counter the belief that they are simply perversions of the Jedi, and nothing more than evil mages. Some of the training included the two of them going on a hunt for a herd of animals on the low-gravity world of Buoyant. They used nothing but force speed and vibroblades to chase down and slaughter their prey like predators. Plagueis would also have himself and Palpatine fight off an army of combat droids in an experimental city on the world of Hypori. And then there was the time that the two Sith Lords participated in the tradition of fighting the natives of Corsid, as Plagueis had once done with Tenebrous. And in the end, he bit into the heart of their greatest warrior and passed the organ for Sidious to taste. His teachings were that the Sith were a cleansing fire that would improve the lives of every single being in the galaxy, and every being should be pleased to step aside for the Sith, or to have the Sith step on them to achieve their goal. The galaxy owed them everything in gratitude for lifting them out of the mire of stagnation and away from the weak, placating Jedi Order. But when the two men weren't voraciously feasting on the hearts of their kills, or studying the ancient ways of the dark side, they appeared to the public as charming political and financial icons. Palpatine, with Plagueis' help, quickly worked his way into the political circles of Coruscant, and fraternized with beings that represented his planet. Soon enough, the two were mixing their Sith business and political business together. They began maneuvering their pieces in place to get Palpatine in the office of none other than the Supreme Chancellor. At least that was the long game. Ever since inducting Palpatine into the fold of the Sith, the election on Naboo had gone their way. Bon Tapala was now their king, and he was answerable only to the Sith. It was only a matter of time that Palpatine was going to become a senator of Naboo, and to do this, they organized the murder of Senator Vidar Kim, who currently held the position and who had made himself an obstacle to the plan of the Sith. At the next gathering of Sojourn, though, the two Sith Lords conspired with one another while overlooking the revelry, and it was here where the grand plan actually begins to take formal shape. Plagueis goes on a long speech about how the winds are changing, how soon the laws will become more harsh, and fear will spread like a contagion. The galaxy must somehow be returned to a state where barbarism is once again the norm, and armies are roaming the stars. Once the Republic falls and the Jedi are but a memory, the beings of the galaxy will have nowhere to turn but to the Sith. Plagueis decides that when this happens, they will gladly provide them with a sense of stability, a list of enemies to hate, weapons capable of decimating entire star systems, even within Durasteel prisons in which they will feel safe. But for now, they had to take care of some Senate issues which were being caused by the Black Sun Syndicate, as well as the Grand Protectorate of Malastare. But once those were behind them, the Sith would pull together guilds and unions to form a confederacy. Then they would use hive species such as the Colicoids or the Geonosians to manufacture weapons of war in preparation for just that. Sidious, however, points out that the Jedi won't just stand there and do nothing, and while he had no affection for them, he states that he respects their power. To weaken the Republic without weakening the Jedi could provide the Order with justification to attempt a coup. This would allow the Jedi to seize the Republic as they had in the days prior. Plagueis then mentions that the Jedi would have already been finished had it not been for the setback of Darth Gravid, that it was only a matter of time. He tells Sidious of how Tenebrous and his master had once attempted to concoct a virus that would cut the Jedi off from the Force, and Sidious mentioned how such a plan would have failed even if the virus succeeded because of how spread out the Jedi were, which was half of the issue in and of itself. They would need to assign each Jedi their own assassin, and there was no way to keep that many assassins quiet. Plagueis then responds by mentioning two other things: that they don't want the Jedi dying out too quickly, at least not until the Republic had been so ravaged and weakens that the beings of the galaxy willingly embrace the stability of the Sith. And besides, no army could overthrow the Jedi. The old Sith numbered the tens of thousands and failed every time they rose to opposition. But it was here when Sidious had an idea. He mused out loud that the Jedi would need to be taken down from within, lured into a trap from their blind obedience to the Republic. They must be made to appear to be enemies of peace and justice rather than its guardians. This profound statement made Plagueis pause. The revelation of what the grand plan must be was now at last taking form. Outside of politics, Plagueis' experiments were finally going his way. He had managed to get the Yanchori the representation in the Senate that they had desired, and as compensation, they gave him one of their convicts for his experiments. And after nearly 2 years of work, Plagueis managed to undermine the Yanchori's natural defense against Force suggestion. With this single specimen, he gained the power to actually bend the Yanchori's mind to his will. And in the process, he learned a great deal about the habits and nature of midi-chlorians in this very unique species. With ideas of crafting the perfect army to eradicate the Jedi, Plagueis took his research to the world of Kamino. This was a planet that he had been well aware of since the early days of his apprenticeship. The cloners of Kamino were the ones who had supplied Sojourn with the clone monsters to be hunted during the Gathering event. And when speaking with them about the possibility of creating an army, Plagueis had initially hoped to produce Yanchori soldiers. It was the natural choice, of course, as their immunity to many force powers would give them an advantage over Jedi. However, the Kaminoans pointed out that the natural aggression of the Yanchori species would be extremely difficult to control in a military environment, and may interfere with their ability to obey orders. For now, a pin would need to be put in this plan. Later in the year 52 BBY, Plagueis would attend a meeting on the Outer Rim world of Sereno. He was eager to go and represent Damask Holdings there. He had heard that a Jedi of a particular sort was attending, and Plagueis already loved interacting with the Jedi, and rarely missed an opportunity to do so. However, this specific Jedi made him all the more eager. Master Dooku was to be present, as was his apprentice Qui-Gon Jinn and his friend, Master Sifo-Dyas. Long had Plagueis been fascinated with Dooku. He had not only been a skilled lightsaber duelist and diplomat, but he seemed very different than all of the other Jedi. He was swept within the mystery of the Force, but kept one foot in the mundane world, making him more grounded than any other Jedi. He was a critic of the corruption facing the Senate, and kept his ear to the ground on events happening around the galaxy. Plagueis had been aware of Dooku and Qui-Gon for quite some time. Several decades earlier, the two Jedi had unwittingly foiled many of Tenebrous's plots to stir trouble in the expansion region, and Plagueis had been fascinated with the Jedi Dooku. But at this point, Plagueis was pleased with his apprentice, but he had noticed a growing issue with Palpatine. The assassination of their political opponent Vidar Kim had not gone as smoothly as he had hoped. Palpatine had been drunk with power and nearly made many problematic mistakes. Plagueis wanted to ensure that if the worst would happen, that he would have a backup plan should he need a next apprentice. And while he wasn't interested in replacing Sidious altogether, Plagueis did have his eye on Dooku, who showed signs of being ripe for manipulation. After the proceedings of the meeting concluded, Ego Damask found himself alone in the room with 3 Jedi. In the ensuing conversation, Qui-Gon Jinn would call out Damask and the Bacon Clan for supporting predatory entities like the Trade Federation, therefore resulting in difficulties in the Outer Rim. This would be the first time that Plagueis would get to see the intelligence and the quiet strength of Qui-Gon Jinn up close. Once he left the room, it was Plagueis, Dooku, and Sifo-Dyas who all traded remarks about the concerning state of the Senate and their current depraved Supreme Chancellor. The topic of conversation changed, and Damask spoke of impending conflict for the Republic in the future, discussing the possibility of a split in the Republic between the core and the Outer Rim systems. Dooku admitted to the Senate's corruption, and despaired for the possibility of correcting it with force. Sifo-Dyas was much more guarded about his feelings though, not wanting to admit to the possibility of war. However, Plagueis was pleased with his ability of having to seed sows of doubt within the Jedi, specifically within Dooku. And by the end of the discussion, Plagueis was now entirely rethinking his clone army. Perhaps going to the Yanchori soldiers against the Jedi was the wrong way to approach it. Perhaps instead they needed an army to fight alongside them, only to betray them at the final moment. He was ready to exploit Sifo-Dyas' doubt and tell him about the cloners of Kamino, but Plagueis felt in the dark side that the time was not yet right. A few standard months later, and Plagueis would return to Coruscant for an extremely important occasion. A historic event was happening in the Senate, which was convening to vote on whether or not to seat Felucia. But not only Felucia, also Mercana, as well as a half-dozen other client worlds of the Trade Federation. Of course, if these worlds were given recognition, then it would grant them much more power in the Senate, and therefore give even more power to the Trade Federation. This event was not only marked by a vote, but also by it being Palpatine's first time in the political spotlight. It was his first real outing as a senator of Naboo. But to Palpatine's surprise, Ego Damask openly fraternized with him and interacted with Palpatine publicly in front of senators, and in front of Jedi as well. In open daylight, the two Sith were conversing, making it known that they actually knew each other. Palpatine himself was surprised by his master's bold move, but for Plagueis, this was all a part of the plan. Damask Holdings was a huge galactic player, and it being known that he was friends with the Senator of Naboo gave Palpatine a huge boost in public credit and intrigue. It was high risk, high reward, especially because it earned Palpatine the ire of men like Pax's team. In the Senate proceedings that followed, Palpatine would make his big first impression. His decision was to have Naboo abstain from the vote altogether, maintaining a place of neutrality and plausible deniability. This decision had been made at the behest of Plagueis as well as Naboo's current king, King T'Palo. Plagueis' plan was to have the new member worlds to be caught between the Republic that heavily taxed them and a trade federation that exploited them to cultivate discontent and to pave a way for the Sith to become more influential. Palpatine's abstention from the vote allowed the Senate to swing in the favor of the Trade Federation worlds, giving them seats within the Senate itself. But this was again in direct opposition and contrast to Pax's team, which caused him to have even more animosity towards Palpatine and Plagueis. And in a shocking move, the Grand Protectorate kidnapped Palpatine. Pax's team planned to kill him to send a message directly to Higo, but right as Palpatine was about to unleash his powers on the dark side, he was rescued by Damask's Echani Sun Guard. It turns out that Plagueis had not only had his apprentice followed by his agents, but he had also organized the kidnapping to take place. Plagueis revealed to Palpatine that this is the reason that he spoke so publicly to him, to dangle him in front of Pax's team's face so that he could have an excuse to go after him and get rid of him. And just after Plagueis ended communication with his apprentice Palpatine, Plagueis attended to his own business. Following the victory in the Senate, Damask was participating in an initiation ceremony in the Order of the Canted Circle. This was yet another secret gathering for the elite of the galaxy, but this was even more arcane than the gathering was. And so within a meeting hall, the Order of the Canted Circle gathered. But this ceremony was not for Darth Plagueis himself, but for Larsh Hill, the man that had loyally stood by his side and helped make everything happen. But during the ceremony, it became very clear that Pax's team had another mission, more beyond just kidnapping Palpatine. Maladian assassins disguised as hooded and robed Canted Circle members entered the room swiftly. As Plagueis reached out in the Force, he had a sense of foreboding come over him as the dark side alerted him to the impending danger. However, instead of acting on instinct, Plagueis restrained himself for fear of showing his true nature in the dark side, a decision that would prove to be near fatal. In an instant, the assassins decapitated Larsh Hill and sent dozens of razor-bladed discs flying around the room. Almost every member of the Canted Circle, including the Sun Guard standing watch, were murdered within a matter of moments. Plagueis barely dodged the attack, but because he had restrained his instinct, a decapitator disc had made off with a considerable portion of his jawbone, as well as his neck, severing his trachea and several blood vessels in the process. The assassins pulled vibroblades and proceeded to go around butchering anyone still standing. The Dark Lord spat blood, using the Force to heal his neck enough to keep him from lapsing into unconsciousness. There was no use in hiding his true nature now. Plagueis had to fight for his life. The Maladian assassins were extremely tough opponents. They were highly skilled beings who took assassination as a sort of religion. They were known to always carry out their contracts, and they were even known to wound or kill Jedi Knights. But this was Darth Plagueis, a Dark Lord of the Sith. It didn't matter that one of his 3 hearts had already failed. He leapt to his feet and snapped bones, smashed skulls, and punched straight through armor. Every object in the room became a storm of deadly projectiles, and his Force lightning boiled the blood inside their very bodies. The Maladians, being the professionals that they were though, did not shrink at Force powers, but simply changed tactics, coming at Plagueis from various angles and waiting for openings. Another of Plagueis' hearts would eventually begin to fail, however, nearly paralyzing him with the pain. But the Dark Lord managed to throw up an impenetrable Force barrier and released a scream with his damaged vocal cords, one that shattered every eardrum in the vicinity. Another wave of dark power caused an earthquaking tremor in the floor, which took all of the assassins off their feet momentarily. Plagueis was mere moments from unleashing hell on his attackers, with every little bit of energy that he had left. And that is when Darth Sidious entered the room, this time coming to his master's rescue. Sidious managed to figure out that Plagueis was under attack in enough time to arrive, and together, the two unchained the fury of the dark side, and punished the mortal assassins for attempting to step up to the heirs of Darth Bane. Once it was over and done, the floor was pooled with the blood of the assassins and victims alike. Plagueis and Sidious quickly made their exit. Undoubtedly, the Jedi had felt the extreme outbursts of malevolence in the Force, and they were only moments behind. Plagueis was still attempting to cradle his wound, as he was receiving medical attention from 11D, and Sidious was absolutely furious. He knew the location of the Grand Protectorate, and he intended to make them pay. But even more, Sidious wanted to go personally. But as for Plagueis, he was a little worse for wear. As adept as he was at Force healing, it was much more complicated to do it on oneself, and this brush with death had left Darth Plagueis injured beyond repair. In order to survive his grievous injuries, he would need to wear a transpirator that covered his face below his nose, a mark at how close he had brushed with death. But at least Plagueis was now safe. About a month would pass, and it is confirmed that Darth Sidious did indeed massacre the Grand Protectorate. Plagueis summoned Sidious to his mountain laboratory on the world of Moonalist, and here, Palpatine finally saw Plagueis' extensive collection of knowledge, which he had always coveted for himself, all of his master's strange experiments as well. Palpatine would also see experimental weaponry and large monsters. He even witnessed the droid 11D that revealed to him that Plagueis had successfully managed to impregnate a few of these creatures with the Force itself. Force-grown offspring had officially been achieved now, though it was still in its very early testing. Palpatine was absolutely astounded by all of this. He had never seen his master's home before, and now he was here. He could sense that the entire area had been transformed into a dark side nexus. Plagueis sat him down, and the two of them discussed the plans of the future. With all of the members of Damask Holdings having been killed by the assassins, Plagueis said that he wasn't going to reform the company after all. Rather, he was going to groom San Hill, the son of Larsh Hill, to take a chairman seat in the intergalactic banking clan. Plagueis planned on retiring to the moon of Sojourn and moving his entire base of operations there in order to devote himself to the Sith life and the dark side, leaving politics to his apprentice. The recent attempt on his life had reinvigorated his search for immortality, and he was done leading a double life. Plagueis planned on dedicating all of his time to the Sith agenda, their own investigations, and eventually trying to heal himself. Meanwhile, Sidious would be the face of their operations, carrying out all of the political machinations and helping to enrich the core worlds while depriving the Outer Rim to continue sowing discontent. Sidious would mention that after the events on Coruscant, that there was still a risk at their exposure. They needed an agent skilled in stealth and combat in order to take care of the more gritty business. They needed an acolyte. He suggested someone who was trained in the dark arts but could never aspire to be a true Sith Lord, therefore not technically endangering the Rule of Two. It is here where Palpatine reveals something. He proposes a Zabrak infant that he had been provided from the world of Dathomir, a boy who would become Darth Maul. Plagueis was intrigued by the opportunity and approved the training of this young Sith assassin. And so once again it was time for the sands of our hourglass to run. 10 years would pass until the year 42 BBY. After 10 years of intense study, Plagueis began perfecting his control over the midi-chlorians. He then summoned Sidious to his new lab, where he showed how Venomous was still technically alive. The old traitor. Plagueis allowed him to die before manipulating the midi-chlorians and pulling him back from death. Plagueis then did this again, allowing Venomous to die before resurrecting him. Palpatine was astounded, shook to his very core at the depth of which his master had begun to toy with life and death. Drunk with power, Plagueis then did it over and over again, yo-yoing Venomous's very life until his organs failed. To Plagueis, this indicated a shift in the currents of time and the Force itself. Plagueis believed that his power had reached a level for the Sith to challenge the Force for its dominance, to give it sovereignty, control. Sidious and Plagueis then entered a meditative trance and managed to tip the scales of balance in favor of the darkness. This is huge because it officially begins the process of clouding the Jedi's visions so that they cannot look into the future, nor use the Force to peek behind the curtain of current events. Now feeling unstoppable, Plagueis attempted to go one step further and attempted to create life, mentally reaching out to the inhabitants of the galaxy to connect to each of them. This was an act in direct violation of the nature of the Force. Plagueis and Sidious attempted to will a being of their own design into life and creation, pouring their malicious intent into the waves of the Force to countless midi-chlorians that were spread across the galaxy. Unfortunately for the Sith though, the experiment did not yield fruit, as Plagueis perceived the Force growing silent to his probing. Immediately after the ritual, all of Plagueis' test subjects, especially the ones born from Force-based impregnation, began to succumb to various horrible diseases. Inexplicitly, all of Plagueis' experiments would die off. In response, the Dark Lord set most of the survivors free. Some of the animals that he had altered even had adapted to the forests of Sojourn, and though he could still command it, the Force seemed to flee from Darth Plagueis. Plagueis ended up developing a theory that the Force was actively opposed to the Sith's efforts, and so anytime a setback occurred, he saw the failure in this light. This fueled his desire to rival the Force itself for control, however. Plagueis' greatest enemy had revealed itself. It was not the Jedi, it was not politics, it was the Force who now stood in direct opposition to his will. But regardless, the two Sith continued to grow in power and influence. They would shape galactic events to their whims, causing strain on the Outer Rim worlds and making them furious at the core, inciting incidents that tested the resolve of the Jedi. But importantly, they tested the Senate's ability to resolve a crisis. One of these incidents was on Galadran with the Mandalorians, an event that would deeply shake Dooku's resolve in the Jedi, his faith in their order. Soon enough, Plagueis' own manipulations with the Yin-Chor would bear fruit, as they seceded from the Republic and began conquering planets in their own system. Sidious had been supplying them with weapons which they used to launch an attack straight on the Jedi Temple. The Yin-Chori crisis was put down though, but it came at the cost of many lives of Jedi. Finally came the year 34 to 32 BBY, that now begins the final chapter of our story. A galaxy weakened, the Sith prepare for rise. Chapter 5, The Tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. Since the attack from the Maladian assassins, Plagueis had become something of a hermit. He rarely left his fortress world of sojourn and remained there surrounded by droids, still contributing financially to the goings-on in the galaxy however, but infrequently getting involved with them personally. Plagueis would construct a triangular-shaped breath mask of his own design, connected by 2 tubes to a respirator on his chest. The attack on his life had most assuredly weakened the Dark Lord physically, but he had continued to grow into a vessel of unimaginable power in the Force and in the dark side. Determined to never again be caught off guard, Plagueis trained himself to go without sleep. The past 2 decades had been dedicated to nothing else but the day and night experimentation with the midi-chlorians, and attempts to wrestle a few last secrets from the Force. All of this was in the pursuit of prolonging his life indefinitely, and he was getting closer than he had ever been before. He was now on the cusp of mastering the very concepts of the order and disorder, creation, entropy, life, death. But all of this did not come without great cost. Plagueis had ceased hosting the gatherings on Sojourn, and the Grand Palace had somewhat fallen into disrepair. He became somewhat insane by his experiments. Palpatine only had updates on his condition by speaking with Plagueis' sun guards, those that still remained behind on the world of Sojourn. They reported that Plagueis had locked himself in his quarters and was scarcely ever seen. The few times that he summoned them though, they came in to find his living quarters in shambles, subjects dead in their cages, and droids malfunctioning. Plagueis himself had grown thin from a lack of feeding himself, unwashed and erratic in his behavior. 11-4D was actually the one who would relay orders to the Sun Guard on Plagueis' behalf, and Palpatine himself only communicated with his master directly through the holo, and he did suspect that his master was now beginning to slip into total insanity. In his absence, Palpatine had begun to take his training into his own hands. Sidious has finally gotten to visit the Sith worlds that Plagueis had never allowed him to see before, and Sidious sneakily used the vast library from his master's former mountain fortress to learn as much as he could. Sidious felt that Plagueis was making himself too much of the focus at the neglect of the grander Sith plan. Plagueis was obsessed, and he was becoming dangerous. He cared so much more about himself than the Sith at large, and it was now falling to Sidious's shoulders to arrange and execute the schemes that would place the two of them in a power on Coruscant. Plagueis believed that their partnership was going as necessary, but Sidious directed galactic events in the same way that Plagueis was overseeing the currents of the dark side. From the Master's perspective, Sidious had a gift for subterfuge that surpassed the talents of any Sith Lord before him, including even Darth Bane. Despite his gripes, the grand plan was still unfolding as necessary. Chancellor Valorum was in office currently, and Palpatine was doing everything he could to make him look foolish and impotent. The galaxy was in turmoil, and the Senate was constantly in chaos. They argued perpetually, never actually getting anything done. To make things worse, the Trade Federation was now demanding that either the Republic raise a pan-galactic army, or give them the ability to raise a security army of their own in order to protect their assets from piracy in the Outer Rim. The foundations of peace and stability were shaken, and it was all setting the stage for Palpatine to come in and provide that stability himself. Currently, the plan was for Palpatine to take the office of the Chancellor, and then elect Higo Damask as his co-chancellor, thereby having both Sith take the office of the Republic. Amidst all of the Yin-Chori crisis taking place, Palpatine soon visits his master on Sojourn, where he shows him a hologram recording of Maul's recent training. Fascinated, Plagueis was impressed with the assassin's skill. And when his saber staff was revealed, the Dark Lord is even more astonished that he wields a weapon of Exar Kun. Pleased with the assassin's progress, Plagueis knows that the time is nigh for the final stages of the plan, and he begins to instruct Sidious that it's time for them to begin revealing themselves to a select few. He is to approach Nute Gunray with an expensive gift, and offer to make all of his dreams come true. Sidious can make him ascend to the controlling directorate of the Trade Federation in exchange for loyalty. This will set up the blockade of Naboo, which will perfectly prove that Chancellor Valorum is inept, causing a vote of no confidence in the Senate. Palpatine himself will get a pity vote into office, and all will go as the Sith have planned. They only needed to move the new king of Naboo, Aris Varuna, into the position, but he may prove to be more difficult to control. As Sidious was dispatched to start moving pieces in line, Plagueis decided to do some piece moving himself. For the first time in 20 years, outsiders were allowed on sojourn for business, and this particular outsider would be Jabba the Hutt. Gardulla hadn't been making her payments in full to Damask as directed by their previous agreement, and Jabba had decided to take advantage of this and ask Damask to cut ties with her and support him instead so that he could rule Tatooine. As payment, Jabba supplied Plagueis with information about a terrorist group known as the Banda Gora. This caught the Sith Lord's attention, since the group had been making life difficult for some of the cartels that Plagueis had backed in the Outer Rim. He learned from Jabba that their leader was Komori Vosa, the former Padawan of one Jedi Dooku. This would end up being extremely valuable information that Plagueis would eventually pass on to Sidious, who then in turn would tell Dooku after he embraced the dark side. Dooku soon became Darth Tyrannus, and would later use Komori Vosa and Bando Gora as test subjects for Jango Fett, to see if he was truly fit to become the prime clone for the Kamino project. Elsewhere in the galaxy, Palpatine was starting to maneuver all of the events to take place for the coming blockade of Naboo. Varuna himself was a corrupt king who had largely lost the favor of the people, especially after he had allowed the Trade Federation to gain power for many years. Due to the machinations of Palpatine and Damask, Varuna was wanting to rebel against the Federation, and had designed a new line of N1 starfighters in order to chase them off. Sidious decided to manipulate him into reconsidering once he told him that the Senate was about to allow the Federation to arm itself. Chancellor Valorum was about to start taxing the free trade zones, and the Trade Federation was voting against this. But if Varuna continues to vote in support of the Federation, he would drastically lose support of the people and be removed from office in the next election. Palpatine pretended to be his friend, an advisor on the matter, but he secretly wanted him to be removed. Behind his back, Palpatine was speaking to the Naberi family, whose young daughter Padme had become the governor of Naboo at only 13 years old. Padme had a massive support from the people, and Palpatine convinced her parents that if Padme were to run for the throne, that he could ensure her victory. Unfortunately though, all of this would make it back to Varuna, who had long since held scorn for Higo Damask and Palpatine, two men he believed had worked together to keep Naboo under their thumb. Varuna invited Palpatine to a banquet to corner him about the topic though, and in their company was a Black Sun crime lord, Gardulla the Hutt, as well as agents from the Bando Gora. A large group of unsavory characters, all of whom felt betrayed by Higo Damask. Palpatine took note of all of them, and Varuna confronted him about his treachery. He announced that once he was re-elected, he was removing Palpatine as senator and ending his agreement with the Trade Federation and Damask. Instead, it would be Gardulla, the Black Sun, and the Bando Gora that would see the export of plasma and the import of goods. Now having officially betrayed the two Sith, Palpatine told Varuna that he'll be sure to tell Damask of his decision the next time the two meet. But Varuna told him not to concern himself, telling Palpatine that he would never see Higo Damask again. Back on the moon of Sojourn, Plagueis was dashing around his fortress, triple-checking that he deleted every file, that he had freed or slaughtered every beast that he had created. All that he needed was loaded aboard his escape ship, and he was boarding it right as 5 battleships had arrived within the system. Through his inexplicable network of contacts and spies, Plagueis had gained the knowledge of his enemies, largely Gardulla and Varuna, and they had organized to attack and murder him there. But Plagueis had prepared his escape, and he made it out just in time for the battleships to rain fire on his fortress. To ensure that the mask was dead, they had managed to get their hands on actual nuclear devices, and used one to completely level everything in the radius of Plagueis' fortress castle. The place that he had spent so many weeks, hours, years of his life, now reduced to rubble and glass. The Dark Lord admitted to himself that he was deeply moved. He had not experienced so many powerful emotions such as loss and sorrow since he had left Megiddo with Tenebrous as a very young boy, and he was somewhat glad to be feeling something again. Finally clearing the moon, Plagueis was relieved to find that Jabba the Hutt had come to his rescue. Arriving just on the far side where they could not be seen, Jabba's ship, the Star Jewel, managed to pull Plagueis' ship with an attractor beam. As he was being pulled in, Plagueis requested that Jabba take him directly to Coruscant, but to also open a line of communication to Naboo. Not only did Plagueis want to inform King Varuna that he had survived the attack, but he wanted to let him know the kind of hellish wrath that would be coming for him. Varuna was terrified that Damask had survived, and he immediately abandoned the throne and went into hiding on the countryside. This allowed Padme to win by a landslide, earning her the throne and the regent name of Amidala. The taxation of free trade zones then went into effect, enraging the members of the Trade Federation. Plagueis and Palpatine had also put Newt Gunray as the viceroy, and he had removed the 7-person leadership of the Trade Federation and disposed of them quietly. Everything was in place for the blockade of Naboo, and Plagueis met with Sidious on Coruscant only briefly to discuss what was to happen next. During the meeting, Palpatine noted that to his surprise, Plagueis was no longer the wild-eyed mystic that he had seen months earlier. He was no longer crazed and reclusive, but appeared stronger, more in control. He possessed a renewed fury, one that made him look merely like an older version of the man that Palpatine had met on Naboo, returned to his former power and glory. Sidious marveled at his master. The very fact that he escaped the bombardment of Sojourn made him appear almost omnipotent to him, and Sidious began to feel great envy. During their meetings, the Sith Lords began to discuss the Clone Wars in great detail. The plan for having Amidala take the throne is that she is a compassionate girl that won't see her people suffer for long at all. Palpatine will get a pity vote into the Chancellor's office, and Padme will wait longer than a month before signing a treaty that hands all of Naboo and its exports completely over to the Trade Federation. The acquisition of Naboo will demonstrate the failings of diplomacy, and will prompt a sense of militancy among the Jedi. In preparation for war, they had battle droid factories already churning out on Geonosis. As the two Sith began discussing the possibility of a clone army grown on Kamino, one of humankind, but this cannot be tracked directly back to them. Plagueis knows of a man though that can manipulate into having the clone army ordered beyond the Sith. That man is named Sidious. Just as they desired, the Jedi will soon have a full army at their disposal once their plans are complete. Then it's a matter of managing both sides of the war. Everything for the Sith was coming together nicely. Plagueis felt that revenge was not only necessary, but now deserved. He didn't want to simply dispatch Maul to be used against Varuna. He felt that he should deal with his old friend himself. And he would go to Naboo personally, his first outing as a Sith Lord in well over 20 years. Like a wraith in the dark, Plagueis blended himself into the shadows as he stalked Varuna's palace retreat and snuck inside his bedroom. Plagueis disabled the former king's security systems and woke him from his sleep. After choking him to ensure that he would not scream out for help, Damask began to clue him in on who, or rather what, he really was. What he had been all this time. Plagueis let him know that he apprenticed under Rugus Gnome, whose real name had been Darth Tenebrous, Dark Lord of the Sith. Varuna was aware of what the Sith were, and that is when Darth Plagueis told him his real name, what he was. And by the time this happened, Varuna was on death's door. The entire time they were talking, Plagueis had been subtly manipulating the man's midi-chlorians to return to their source, to the Force, and just by being in his presence, Plagueis had willed Varuna to die. This was the result of 2 decades of pure study of the dark side. Plagueis now had command over life and death. With that business out of the way, it was time for Plagueis to move forward with his next order of business, the creation of a clone army. There was a big gala that Palpatine and Damask were attending, in which one had a big meeting for the candidates of the Chancellor's office. Extremely important people from around the galaxy, and of course, several Jedi including even Yoda, Mace Windu, Adigalia, Jorah Sabayoth, and Sidious. Plagueis and Palpatine talked privately for a moment about some recent issues with one of Maul's missions, and then Plagueis resumed his mask as Higo Damask in order to speak with the Jedi Sidious. The two of them made small talk before Damask brought up the conversation that they had once had about the state of the Republic. He divulged to Sidious that the Trade Federation was arming itself beyond what was supposed to be allowed, and he told the Jedi that he believed the Republic was under increasing threat of a civil war. Not only because of this, but because of the strain between the core and the Outer Rim worlds that was now irreversible. Sidious agreed with the secret Sith Lord's sentiment, and admitted to having visions of a foreboding future. The Jedi tried to tell his master Yoda and the rest of the Jedi Council, but they had all dismissed him. Plagueis, however, insisted that the Republic needed an army whether the Senate or the Jedi was willing to vote for one or not. They were too stagnant in their arrangements, and needed to be provided with one before it was far too late. And it was here when Plagueis introduced the idea of the Kaminoan cloners to the Jedi. Sith Order was uncertain, and mentioned that the Republic would never sanction it, nor would the Jedi High Council agree. But Plagueis convinced him to circumvent both parties in order to create it himself. And to make things even more appealing, Darth Plagueis offered to pay for the entire thing away from the prying eyes of the Republic, using his connections and banks in the Outer Rim so that it was not traceable. He made the idea sound as though it was just a backup plan, something for the Jedi and the Republic to have in their pocket should the war arise. And while Sith Order said that he would need some time to think about it, Plagueis knew that that is exactly what the Jedi wanted. Everything was going perfect, and according to plan, and it was time for the blockade of Naboo to commence. Plagueis gave Palpatine the go-ahead, and Palpatine ordered the Trade Federation to commence the blockade in protest of the taxation of the free trade zones. The Sith's victory was nigh, until everything did not go according to plan. The blockade of Naboo did not have the intended effect on the Senate, who, to the shock of the Sith, responded a bit lackadaisically. Queen Amidala reached out to Senator Valorum personally for help. Valorum, who was currently being stripped of his senatorial powers, decided to circumvent due process, and would go directly to the Jedi Council for help. Leveraging his friendship with the High Council personally, he asked them as a favor to dispatch 2 Jedi as Republic ambassadors in order to deal with the situation. At the time, Plagueis was meeting with Palpatine about the election, when Valorum sent the message to Palpatine explaining that he had sent the Jedi. Both Sith Lords were completely blindsided, as if the Jedi managed to get their hands on Gunray, then they could make him squeal about the Sith's involvement. Worse yet, they had dispatched Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi, a famous and a pesky Jedi duo. Plagueis was almost in a state of panic. Despite all his talk about the Sith being invincible, he knew the reputation of these 2 Jedi. He had met Qui-Gon Jinn years ago. He mentioned that he was absolutely nothing like any arrogant Jedi that Plagueis had ever encountered, and Sidious said that he would have Gunray initiate the invasion at once, so that they would not give the opportunity to Qui-Gon to make it to Gunray himself. What's more though, is that he would dispatch Maul. Plagueis then said that it seemed the time had come for them to reveal themselves to the Jedi at last, for them to take revenge. Some time would pass, and Plagueis was watching Maul and Sidious talk to one another from afar. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan had managed to rescue the Queen of Naboo and her entourage, blasting through the blockade and heading for deep space. A phony transmission was sent to her ship by Maul, and the response to it alerted the Sith that the group had landed on a world, one they were familiar with, Tatooine. Alarmed by this, Plagueis briefly considered contacting Jabba the Hutt again in order to have them apprehend the Queen and the Jedi. But Plagueis sensed something, and he feared what the dark side would ask him in return. He already owed Jabba a great debt for having saved his life on Sojourn, and he listened intently on Maul and Sidious's conversation for what would happen next. Plagueis was becoming extremely paranoid, having misgivings. He could not see the future. It remained silent to his probing for answers, but he had a feeling that Maul would fail. As more time passed, Plagueis and Sidious continued to rapidly adjust to the changing course of events. More maneuverings had to take place for Palpatine to garner support in the Senate. And meanwhile, Maul had not succeeded in killing Qui-Gon on Tatooine, and his Crimson Blade identified him as a Sith Lord. The Jedi were going to arrive soon on Coruscant, and Plagueis denied to accompany Palpatine to meet them in person. With 2 very powerful Jedi in sight and present, Plagueis feared that the Sith Lord's combined presence in the Force would tip them off to their learnings, despite their natural power. That is how much Plagueis feared Qui-Gon Jinn. However, something would happen that would completely tear everything to shreds, destroy the plan of the Sith before Plagueis' very eyes, at least as he was concerned. Palpatine had met with Dooku, who had come to inform him about his official desire to depart from the Jedi. Palpatine learns that him and Qui-Gon have returned with a boy about 9 years of age, a boy who they believe is the Chosen One. Supposedly this boy was a slave with no father, but an unpredictably high midi-chlorian count, higher than they had ever seen before. Palpatine was shocked though to see that Dooku really thought nothing of it, and believed that if the Council had any sense, that they would refuse to train the boy. Sidious, however, was shaken to his core, for he remembered the day exactly 9 years ago, the day when he and his master had tipped the scales of balance, and had attempted to bring into existence a perfect, forceful being. Meanwhile, Plagueis had been on his way to the Senate Rotunda where he would eagerly listen to Queen Amidala call for a vote of no confidence in Valorum. This would be the first death knell of the Republic, but he had received a transmission last minute from his apprentice about the conversation that he had had with Dooku. Now instead, Plagueis was rushing through the corridors of the 500 Republica penthouse, as he hoped and prayed that the boy Anakin Skywalker was still in Palpatine's apartment. Qui-Gon had apparently sensed the boy to be a virgin in the Force, and believed him to be the Jedi chosen one. But Plagueis had to see it himself. He had to sense the boy. He had to know if the Force had struck back against the Sith, conceiving a being to restore balance to the galaxy. And when Plagueis arrived at the apartment, he was greeted by one of Padme's handmaidens. Using the Force to compel her to speak, Plagueis demanded that she bring the boy to him. But it was now too late. Qui-Gon had already taken him to the Jedi Temple to be appraised by the High Council. Learning of this, Plagueis began reeling. There was still a chance that the Council would decide that Anakin was too old to be trained. But if not, if Qui-Gon could convince the Council to renege on their old doctrine, Plagueis was now in a full panic, and the only thing he could think to himself was, "Are we undone? Have you undone us?" Plagueis would make a pit stop at the Senate Rotunda, arriving late to meet with his apprentice. The two sat in on the meeting where Palpatine was nominated by several important figures for the position of Chancellor. The decision was met with a roaring cheers from all corners of the Rotunda, and Palpatine was pleased and believed that they were all on the cusp of victory, that the Sith were on the cusp of victory. Plagueis, however, needed to be sure of this win. Later, Plagueis would watch Qui-Gon and Anakin walk out of the landing pad after exiting the Jedi Temple. They stopped to speak for a moment, as Anakin questioned the Jedi Master about what midi-chlorians were. Appropriately, the very man who had commanded them like no other was watching from a great distance, although through electro-binoculars. Plagueis could not make out what they were saying, but he could tell that whatever they were talking about had vexed the young boy. Lifting his face from the macro-binoculars, Plagueis would stretch out in the Force to detect something, to feel anything. It was here where Plagueis would fall victim to an assault of perplexing images. Ferocious battles in deep space, the clashing of lightsabers, partitions of radiant light, a black-helmeted cyborg rising from a table. When all of these visions of what was certainly to come had faded, Qui-Gon and the boy were gone, and Plagueis was trying desperately to make sense of what he had just glimpsed. But Plagueis understood the fact of two things. The boy would change the course of history, but Qui-Gon Jinn needed to die. Maul had to kill him. Qui-Gon Jinn was the key to everything. But while events in the realm of the Force were proceeding unexpectedly, the grand plan was unfolding without any delay. Palpatine had been elected Supreme Chancellor, and the two Sith Lords went on to celebrate at a night at the opera. And finally, the two of them would retire to the penthouse of Higo Damask. He had given the Sun Guards the night off so that the two Sith could enjoy some privacy, some conversation, and celebration. Wine was flowing freely as they relished in their moment of triumph, and toasted to decades of planning and brilliant execution. Palpatine then decided to go ahead and rehearse his acceptance speech, which would come with him electing Damask as his co-chancellor. He would rehearse it over and over again, as the two of them made slight tweaks. But as the night wore on, and more bottles of the Sullustan wine were brought out, one bottle turned to 3, and then 3 to 4. Palpatine relentlessly droned on with his speech until finally, Darth Plagueis passed out drunk on his sofa, finding some rest and sleep after decades. Sidious grabbed his cloak and began his departure, but stopped short of the door. Palpatine had heard something, the same thing that his master heard 30 years ago on Baldemnik. The voice of the dark side. It whispered in his ear, "Your election is assured, the Sun Guards absent, Plagueis unsuspecting and asleep." Sidious would never get another moment like this again. Plagueis was simply too powerful, too dangerous, too knowledgeable. He seemed to know everything. He had all the power at his beck and call. He never slept except for on this one occasion when his defenses were lowered out of sweet triumph and victory. Sidious moved in a blur. Lightning crackled from his fingertips and incinerated the breathing device on the moon's chest. Plagueis' eyes shot open, and he went to defend himself. Plagueis first tried to call upon the Force to keep himself from suffocating, as Sidious was momentarily taken aback, wondering if his master had deluded himself into actually thinking that he had achieved immortality. Drawing upon the dark side more deeply than he had ever done before, Sidious loosed another stream of lightning and informed Plagueis that he would be going over the second part of his speech. Palpatine mocked him, spit venom at him for everything Plagueis had done to him in his life, from manipulating him as a boy, to withholding his most powerful secrets despite calling each other equals. As Plagueis spit and gasped for air, attempting to get to his feet, Sidious laid into him for selfishly focusing on his quest for immortality, shirking the Sith grand plan, turning his equally powerful partner into a messenger boy, having the gall to believe that after all of this, Sidious would promote him to co-chancellor. Plagueis now managed to stand and began to conjure a force storm, sending the room into shambles as every object whipped into a fury. But Sidious unleashed another bolt of force lightning, enough to pin Plagueis back to the couch. He reached out and began to choke him while continuing his speech of mockery and hatred. He pointed out how all of Plagueis' best ideas were his, all cleverly fed to him as suggestion to make it seem as though he was the mastermind. All the while Palpatine stood by and had absolutely no intention of sharing any power with him. Plagueis attempted to gather his midi-chlorians to save his life, but both being too drunk and severely weakened, the Dark Lord could no longer defend himself. Rendered helpless under his own apprentice's power, he was left as a bystander to his own demise. And at long last, under the cruel cackling of the man that he had trained and trusted, Darth Plagueis, the man who had dedicated almost every waking hour of his life to conquering death, would die at his apprentice's feet. And thus ends the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. I've said it before, but the Darth Plagueis novel is easily my favorite Legends book out of the entire roster. James Luceno does an absolutely amazing job at characterizing Plagueis, Sidious, and even the dark side itself. The machinations run so deeply that even we here at the archives had to use a lot of effort in untangling and explaining it all for this documentary event. But it was genuinely a privilege to take such a close look at the life of Plagueis. It's easy to only focus on what he managed to do in the Force, how strong he became as a Sith Lord. But what we were pleased to highlight today is his full life and how he became the puppet master of the entire galaxy. He used money, politics, and influence to tie strings on each joint of the Republic and make it dance for him like a marionette. He was instrumental in the Sith's rise to prominence, and even for the Clone Wars to occur. I would say that I consider Plagueis to be quite underrated when it comes to discussing the best Sith Lords in all of galactic history. Not only does he bring the power, but the intelligence, and the sinister cunning that makes him appear nigh omnipotent, even to Palpatine. More than once, Sidious was left dumbfounded and astounded by his master's power and intellect. It was no wonder that he took advantage of the single and first opportunity that he was provided with to eliminate him. It's more than likely that he would never have gotten a second chance. But as we wrap up this documentary, we want to give you a personal huge thank you. If you've made it this far, then you clearly care as much about this lore as we do, and we at the Archives of the Stupendous Wave want to show our appreciation for all of you who continue to watch the channel and show your support. But now that Plagueis' midi-chlorians are returning to where they came from, it's now time for us to do so as well. So until next time, may the Force be with you, and I hope you're having an amazing day. And lastly, I hope you enjoyed today's tale. It's not a story the Jedi would tell you.